Joining us tonight is Lisa Boeving-Learned, a veteran of both the military and law enforcement. She's a former Army soldier trained at the U.S. Army Intelligence School, and she served at Fort Meade, and she spent 25 years with the Tampa Police Department, where she led community policing initiatives, domestic violence, outreach, and offender monitoring programs that earned federal recognitions. She retired as a senior sergeant and now writes and speaks about law enforcement accountability, constitutional duty, and resisting political pressure that undermines ethical public service. So welcome to the show, Lisa. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So full disclosure, you and I know each other. We go way, way back, and I've seen you in a lot of these battles, both before you retired, being willing to take on the brass around things that you saw as unethical. But since retirement, you have really jumped headfirst into this conversation about, the old saying, if you have one bad cop and 9 good cops that let that bad cop go, then you really have 10 bad cops, right? So talk about, as you watch the West Point and as you look at what's unfolding with Trump pardoning the Capitol Police, the people who attacked, maimed, and led to the death of Capitol Police, what goes through your head, and how do we begin to have the conversation about what they will do when the illegal order inevitably comes?
Well, it's a great question, and I appreciate you bringing up the topic because I think you and I do know each other long enough that you know that when Trump first was elected the first time, I posted that on social media to my law enforcement friends. What are you going to do because it's coming? And the sad thing that I saw when I did watch the entire West Point speech because I kind of torture myself in those ways. I like to see things for myself and hear, not to have people tell me what he said or anything. But what disturbed me was when he was, telling his biggest lies and attacking, transgender people and all these things, was the laughs from the audience. And that disturbed me. I mean, it wasn't, I'm sure all, but what bothers me when I see either military or policing, a lot of the people that I used to work with or people that I see online, social media, is the going along and desensitizing and just getting further and further down the rabbit hole, which reminds me of, Weimar Republic of Germany, that, the police were the ones that were utilized on the street. And when I see ICE roundups and local police participating, that's kind of, it's history rhyming to me.
Yeah, it is really astonishing to see the normalization of the attack on law, and how some people who are in the business of law are willing to go along with these extraordinary activities. The idea that people showing up to a court proceeding or a naturalization proceeding would be just seized by people not showing their badge, not working with the local authorities, not talking to the courthouse saying, hey, we'd like to do a transfer of this prisoner into federal custody, just the normal things that have been going on for years in terms of how the federal and state, or even the federal governments deal with each other. And then to see, like the circumstance up a few weeks ago where the student was basically kidnapped off the street by people without uniforms on, with masks, putting her into a car, and how dangerous that is for everyone else walking around to not know. So when some car pulls up, are these kidnappers, or are these the kidnappers that are basically think that they're doing the bidding of the Department of Homeland Security in seizing people without, showing any sort of, proper credentials? And so I was going to ask you about this, Lisa, because I so appreciate your experience and your courage. When I was looking at the Posse Comitatus Act, one of the things that I looked at that really sort of blew my mind after John Roberts' decision to orchestrate the immunity from criminal prosecution for Trump was that that posse comitatus is based on the idea that basically the law enforcement cannot be engaged in the military cannot be engaged in domestic law enforcement in a way that's illegal. And yet now Trump has this capacity to call something an official act where he issues an order. And then the penalty is sort of like, well, you won't get paid for doing it. If you do this posse comitatus seems inadequate to this moment, in part because we now have a president who has immunity from criminal prosecution. And I actually think, I don't know how we even, would stop someone from being paid for conducting an illegal raid, when in fact it seems like some of the activities the courts have found to be unlawful, if not illegal, but unlawful, and yet people are still being paid to enact this policy. So I don't. What are there rules? Are there state laws? Are there any places to help protect against the deployment of police and military in a Weimar Republic sort of way?
That's a great question, because some states and municipalities have tried to enact local ordinances, but the dry run for all these things, this has been happening for quite a while. We've been frogs boiling for a while. There's been the constitutional sheriff's movement that started, again, 10 years ago, and then we had similar activities in like Portland, during the racial justice protests, unmarked vans pulling up and people jumping out and grabbing citizens off the street. These kinds of things have been these dry runs, and I would argue with not a lot of pushback. And we've entered a period where citizens, and this is where police officers, military people say, well, we're just part of society too. And this is where we have to draw these lines, because there's so many people now with the thought process. I heard somebody say the other day, they're normalizing, actually, unbelievably, it was the Cato Institute. A gentleman of one of the Cato videos said they are normalizing the idea that we're going to float these ideas that maybe we all agree with, like, police officers, for instance. My whole career, it's frustrating to have to, dot your I's, cross your T's, and if you make a little mistake, somebody's going to, maybe not be convicted. But we've always understood that rule of law protected us too, and that we didn't get upset about that, but we're crossing a Rubicon to where we're saying, well, they're just criminals and we don't care anymore. And once you do that, because the person isn't convicted, it's maybe an accused person, maybe we arrested them for probable cause, but they haven't been convicted in a court of law. A lot of these people that have been rounded up, they haven't gotten their day in court. And once you erase rule of law and the steps in our government, then nobody is safe, in my view. And to have military and law enforcement people buying into that is pretty dangerous to me.
Now, you would have thought after January 6th that watching this assault on Capitol Police, watching people physically maimed, eyes gouged, backs broken, activities that led to the death of Capitol Police officers, that the thin blue line, that there would be some sense of pushback from within law enforcement. And then if it didn't even kick in then, that when Trump pardoned these people and has lifted them up as heroes, that there would be some part of law enforcement that would push back. But what are you actually seeing? And what do you hear from, the folks that you communicate with in law enforcement?
Well, thankfully, there are, people like me that are aghast at all of this and trying to just raise the issue with our peers and talk to each other and remind each other that, hey, this isn't okay. But there's a striking number of people that I have just watched them jump all over those of us that try to say this was horrific. We cannot allow, this kind of thing to happen. People that attack law enforcement should be, and are convicted should be in prison. And there's a surprising number of, former and current law enforcement that, because of their political ideology, they're willing to suspend that. And what I realized is that watching January 6th was that for a certain segment of folks that are really diehard Trump supporters in law enforcement and in the military, they're willing to suspend that depending on who you're being asked to defend. So really, sadly, the Capitol Police were defending the wrong things in their view, and so then they're expendable, and that's really crushing to me. Yeah, I can only imagine what Michael Fanone and them feel like. I can't.
Yeah, and Harry Dunn. But
Yeah,
you've
Harry
seen there are some veterans who are beginning to organize around these principles of the oath meaning something, the honor code meaning something.
Yep.
You see,
Yes, yes. Yeah, there's a gentleman. His name's Chris Goldsmith on Substack. He runs an organization called Veterans Against Fascism, and I've sort of kind of tried to reach out and hook up with him. I've had some conversations with him, doing great work. I'd like to do something similar, with law enforcement. So if you're law enforcement adjacent or supportive, hit me up on Substack, and we'll start chatting about it, because I know there are good people still that just are afraid. They're just going along, keeping their heads down, because it's become such a normal thing of this back the blue. But January 6th taught us that back the blue is only a political slogan. This new version of Republicans does not back the blue. They don't care.
It really is shocking, and sorry for that audio interruption. I was trying to find Chris Goldsmith's Memorial Day message because it was just so powerful. I'm so glad you mentioned him, Lisa, and really appreciate your initiative for law enforcement, because there really are so many people who are in the police who have come to those jobs to protect our communities and take seriously that duty to defend our Constitution and to defend the citizenry, although obviously not all, as we've seen emerging. Even some of the people who were at January 6th, who were law enforcement, who were there coordinating with some of these groups that were dedicated to the overthrow of our government, basically. But there are so many. I feel like one of the things that not you, but that I can forget sometimes in the midst of all of this, is that actually it's probably the case that the majority of people don't have these extreme beliefs, do not believe that January 6th was right, do not believe that law enforcement should be used to pick people up. Most people, in fact, the recent polling shows that most people really understand that due process means it should apply to all of us, because everyone's vulnerable. If there is no way to go to court and say, what are the charges against me? Is there any evidence to hold me?
Right.
And this dates back to the Magna Carta, to 1066 as a guarantee for liberty, that you just cannot have the executive or his agents picking people up without charges. And so I have to believe, and I continue to believe, that most Americans do not support this kind of extremism. And so I believe you have allies out there, Lisa, more than you know, more than we know, who I think, can join together in standing up against this effort to strip us of our most fundamental rights.
Yeah, I know that. I'm not giving up hope. I know that it's just, like our whole society right now, we're all finding our voice, and we all know there's more of us than them. We do, it's just a matter of, in our own way, and the law enforcement way is my way of, going to try to make a mark on it.
Well, I think right now of the Vietnam veterans who came home and became protesters against that war, I think of Tiananmen Square, because we are creating that moment where, this is a president who has proposed using active duty military on protesters, suggested shooting migrants in the leg. I mean, all of these things that are just absolutely illegal. And I think we've got to mentally start preparing and strategically start preparing for the confrontations that will come as these illegal orders are given. Lisa, how can people find you? You've got something you're going to be launching soon on Substack.
Yes, I'm going to be launching. It's going to be a Square Cop in a Round World, and I'm going to be doing some writing and some video, just talking about these kinds of things and raising questions. You've heard me say for almost 20 years now, if we are brave enough to run to gunfire, we should be brave enough to have these hard conversations and and talk about these things. So and then you asked me earlier about Bluesky, and I found it. I am at Lisa B or D Lisa B-L .bluesky.social.
All right. There you go. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on the show and inviting people who want to organize, veterans who want to organize, police who are ready to stand up for the oath that they've taken. And we're gonna go to another topic, but you're perfectly welcome to stay with us as we begin to talk about one of the other places that the Project 2025 strategy is unfolding. So feel free to stick around for our next segment if you like, and we also won't be offended if you duck away.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. So this is a heavy show. Our shows aren't always quite this heavy, but there's just been so much. And this one, I have to confess to a little, I don't know, Schadenfreude. There's a little bit of that in this story. So what we are seeing in this moment, you have to go back and remember that in the aftermath of those massive storms where the MAGA folks were criticizing Biden at every turn, saying he wasn't showing up and FEMA wasn't there, and none of it was true. None of it was true. But they went all in. And so people either believed, or too many people either believed one of two things: that FEMA hadn't shown up, or that FEMA was there on the ground, but if you accepted their help, the government would take your property, right? Even though these two things sort of can't be true at the same time, there you have it. So now, with the frequency and intensity of these massive weather events unfolding, and Trump in office, what's happening with FEMA? Well, FEMA's been gutted. There's the infrastructure for FEMA to show up has been gutted. But even more than that, Trump has, even to his, Huckabee, in Kansas, folks in Kentucky, he has basically said, no help is coming. I mean, he used to say it more like, I don't like your state. I don't like the politics of your state. So screw you, New York, and, go to hell, California. But this is just, it doesn't matter how many times, Sarah Huckabee applied her lips to his haunches. He still isn't coming up off a dime to help as their state is ravaged. And so this is just like Medicaid. You ask yourself, at what point will people realize that there is no that there's no bottom to which they will not sink, that there's no cruelty which they're not willing to inflict, whether you're Arkansas, North Carolina, Washington. And now we are in a time when they've gutted the early warning systems, they've gutted FEMA, they're advocating for states to assume greater responsibility. I was just talking the other day about the West Wing. Like, one of the things that you can't do in the middle of a crisis is go it alone. It requires, your roads are closed. You're in the middle by definition. But this undermines national disaster readiness, all of these things. At what point do people wake up and say, this can't work? We are a United States of America, not 50 individual fiefdoms. And when it comes to helping people in the middle of the most traumatic thing they can experience, we're just going to go tell them, good luck, because it isn't coming.
It it really it's astonishing in a way that they're getting away with this, but it is on this sort of salted earth where they've been attacking FEMA and causing the right-wing ecosphere has been causing people to have a fear, irrational fear of FEMA, so much so that when that hurricane came, as far inland as is it Ashland?
Asheville? Yeah, Asheville.
Right, Asheville, North Carolina, that people were asking the volunteers who came in to help, were they with the Red Cross or were they with FEMA? And some of the people, there were reports that people who were armed and in response, the aid workers answered that they were with the Red Cross, not FEMA, because they feared for their own lives in coming to help, because there'd been such poisoning of people's minds about FEMA. It, in some ways, I think, like I'm reading Chris Hayes' new book about like the most precious commodity is attention. And what's happened with this sort of 24-hour news cycle and Trump's domination of just attention is they are basically screwing people over community by community and getting away with it, because then the news has moved on to the next crisis and the next outrage and the next thing. And so they don't provide emergency aid. People are suffering. They're just fending for themselves. FEMA's not being deployed. It's not being deployed in a highly political way, but it's also not being deployed in a way that's like super arbitrary and, not actually how the governments work. And I hesitate to say this because, the notion of something being un-American has such a negative history because of McCarthyism, but that use of un-American activities committee was just such a grotesque disregard for our First Amendment rights. But when I think about this FEMA situation, I think it is so profoundly un-American, so profoundly anti-American people to not deploy disaster aid. That is one of the president's responsibilities as commander in chief domestically, is to make sure that we help each other as fellow Americans when there are disasters, if there are fires, if there are hurricanes, if there are tornadoes. It doesn't matter how you voted. We all bleed red. We're all Americans. And I also think we need to be helping the world with our foreign aid and USAID, but domestically, the idea that they're getting away with not deploying our emergency capacity, the dollars that Congress already voted for spending to protect us in times of emergency. And as you point out, Nadine, as emergencies are increasing because of the climate changes that are underway, it is deeply un-American. And we need to call out those political leaders that are going along with this nonsense and denying we as Americans access to federal emergency aid. It is outlandish. And again, I'm going to go back to the beginning. We have to hold them accountable. I don't know how, given the gerrymandering and everything else, but we have got to make our voices heard and just politically punish any politician that goes along with or makes excuses for Trump's abdication of responsibility, for Kristi Noem's just incompetence as the head of the Department of Homeland Security in making sure that FEMA is going where the American people need it.
You've just reminded me of two things. One, first of all, you were pounding the table. That's a literal thing. But two, that we have to stop talking about this like it's a government. It's a criminal enterprise. The incompetence is tactical, because they're not there to do these jobs. They're there to figure out how to grab as much cash as possible and pull it into their coffers. And so, of course, they're not going to do the hard work. But Lisa, you've been a first responder for forever, for decades. How do you react to hearing like, yeah, you're on your own?
I was just getting ready to say that, and that's part of my evolution, is realizing that how we do win this is going at it. You taught me this, Nadine, from so many different angles, and everybody thinks about it in terms of what they can understand or what's important to them. And this is what I tell cops. You're the one running into these situations. You're the one, they're calling 911, the police and fire. And if there's no money there, and if there's no equipment there, for you to do this safely, then what? So people have to understand that, they got, even the funding for NOAA, and we don't have any warning anymore with these storms. And first responders are out in the field while their families are home, hoping that, that it enrages me. Just I'm ready to pound on the table too.
We'll have to have a segment of table pounding. Well,
I have a friend who said that I just need a rubber stamp that I can just stamp. That's outrageous, all over the place. That's true, probably true. But there's so many outrages. Yeah,
there really are. But I will say this: I grew up in the Panhandle of Florida, where it's very conservative territory. Very racism, and sometimes when we say things are un-American, I think, nah, they're pretty American. That goes a long way. This kind of terrible attitudes are pretty American. But there is something in a disaster. It doesn't matter if a truck pulls up with Confederate flags. They're going to help you out of the ditch. Like in a hurricane, it would bring a community together. Like there's this shared value. I think of, I don't know, the Serengeti, where lions and giraffes and everyone knew that when this happened, you suspend any of those other things that divide us. And I think there's a value in there that we've got to start reminding each other of. And yeah, it's not going to come from Washington. It's not going to come from these completely incompetent to the jobs they hold, but completely competent to the jobs of gutting the federal government and lining the pockets of billionaires. They're very, very good at that. But we've got to start speaking back to these values about being neighbors to each other and looking out for each other. And because I think that deep down, there is a thing that people care about. And Elon Musk can tell people all day long that empathy makes us weak, but it is the thing. He should spend more time probably working on, I don't know, rockets that don't blow up, right? And I think his board of directors has now told him they want him to put in 40-hour weeks, by the way. And I immediately thought, and he should have to send a memo at the end of the week explaining what he did that week, right?
That created any value whatsoever.
Right, right. And so, but yes, I mean, I remember taking my camper across the country, and I had this malfunctioning thing to try and put up the air, and the trucker that stopped had a Trump shirt on, and I remember him going out of his way, like it felt like he needed to do extra to help, as a way of just saying, hey, can we still have these ties that bind in some way? So anyway, I'm not telling you that that's the end of the cure for all of this is that we all go through a hurricane together and we'll find that special moment. But I do think that we've got to stop expecting any good, decent thing from them and start calling out that good and decent thing in each other despite them.
Yeah. Which is the honor code in law enforcement and military, right? To remind them why they signed up in the first place, to do the right thing.
Yeah. All right. Now, speaking of not the right thing, we have tariffs, which
yes. Oh my gosh.
Tariffs, Tango Mango tariffs, tariff madness.
Okay.
So do you want to kick that off, Nadine?
I will, because if you have not seen this meltdown by Trump, in fact, because this happened like just today, he gets asked about he gets asked about the phrase taco trade. And if you're not familiar with this is a phrase, Trump always chickens out, that it has become so routine. The tariffs are on, the tariffs are off, the tariffs are on, the tariffs are off. They're on for a day, they're off for a day. In fact, it has become so routine that investors wait until he announces a tariff, knowing that the stock market will plunge. They buy the dip, and then they know that he will reverse himself. And, and so this, that you've got Trump when he starts calling you nasty. Like, to him, that's the worst thing he can say. That's a nasty comment. That's the nastiest thing you could say. You're a nasty person. Like, to him, you can almost see little Donald Trump being called nasty by, I don't know, his dad and his governess or whatever, and just having all of this trauma around this word. But yes, so taco trade, it is now, it's true because of how bigly he reacted to it. But you also have to ask yourself, again, just like we did during is he play fighting with Putin? Is Elon Musk play fighting with him for the theatrics of it to look a little bit like they have this, independence. Does he actually deploy these tariffs for the purpose of plunging the stock market for his buddies to scoop up, because we see tons of activity right before he makes a big announcement. There's all of this investigation about, who suddenly started trading right before he makes these big announcements. But yes, we are seeing a Trump always chickens out, being as routine as Taco Tuesday in any place. And again, it got under his skin in a way that, just like watching his nincompoop speech at West Point, you begin to wonder, how frayed at the edges, and how might we begin to ensure that more and more people are tuning into, the crime syndicate that is at the heart of everything that he does.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I was thinking, I'd like to invite Trump or challenge Trump to play poker with me, because I think that nasty is his tell. Like several years ago, 2 decades ago, my mentor said to me, "Oh, you have no poker face, Lisa. Like, you can read me like a book. Like, my outrage."
Well, you start pounding the table when you've got aces.
Exactly. She said, "You really need to start playing poker because you need a poker face." But whenever Trump says something's nasty, it's like a confession that it's true. It's a confession. And I'd love to play poker in that environment, because his tells are just huge. And whenever a question is like the right question, the question that should be asked, that's when he calls it nasty, or that is exactly as you put it. And these tariffs are literally the dumbest tariffs in the history of America. Unless you're trying to just have this whole grift where it's this game where you're trying to take cash in and move these bubbles and try to work your way toward this cryptocurrency stuff with his other agenda. But like, from the standpoint of ordinary American people, this could not be dumber. And the way he announced it was stupid. And the countries that he listed, like the penguin countries, but not Russia, not Korea, it was dumb. Doing it by some sort of weird AI, which basically on the trade deficit versus reality and common sense trade policy. It's all a shakedown machine, which goes to your earlier point, Nadine, about like, how do we describe this administration? I think we need a different word than the Trump administration, because administration implies a sort of legitimacy or rationality that is not manifest in the policies articulated by Trump. And then there's this component of it, like not just the trade thing, but I forgot to mention on the West Point thing, like just the senile-ish comments of Trump, like telling cadets about, trophy wives and yachts. It was like inappropriate, but it was also the sign of his mental, condition, that he cannot stay on message. Just like last week when he was, bragging about how our transportation secretary, decades ago climbed trees fast. Like, these are all just diversions of his mental breakdown. And meanwhile, the media is obsessed with the fact that, Biden was aging and some of his closest people were trying to keep that out of the news. Meanwhile, we're seeing it in real time with Trump. And where's the editorial calling for his resignation? Where's the editorial calling for his cabinet to stand up to his mental meanderings, while he has access to our nuclear codes and is playing this chickening out on trade? It's extraordinary.
Well, let me again thank our guest, Lisa Boeving-Learned, for joining us. Catch up with her on Bluesky and with her new Substack coming out, A Square Cop in a Round World. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a great night.